Okay, here we go. So here's our panel on the Pupfish Hero, which is a book that we're featuring this year through the festival. It's published by ESIA, the Eastern Sierra Interpretive Association, and so Gabriel is here representing them, and the book project was managed by Joe Reidhead, and then illustrated by Susan Greenleaf. So please join me in welcoming all three. And I'll introduce them. So Jeff Gabriel is the executive director of ESIA, which runs the bookstores out of many of the locations in the Eastern Sierra. As director, he's responsible for all aspects of the organization: planning, budgeting, operations, staff, marketing, public speaking, and coordinating with the public and agency partners. Forest Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management. Previously, he was the executive director of Starbase, a Department of Defense youth educational program, and he's worked for Agricultural Retailers Association, National Pork Producers Council, and Pioneer Hybrid International. He also worked on Capitol Hill for 2 congressmen. He was born and raised in Topeka, Kansas, and has a bachelor's in wildlife biology and political science. And then next I have Joe Reidhead. He owns Heritage Project Studio and specializes in preserving legacies and histories through custom books and archives. From his Bishop-based studio, Joe provides editing and ghostwriting, research, archiving, book design and production, and project consulting to private and public clients worldwide. And then I also here have a bio for Susan, maybe. Oh, do it this way. Susan grew up in the Bay Area, California. She spent a lot of time exploring and backpacking California and the West when young. After spending the middle part of her life in Vermont on a small farm, she returned to California, settling in Bishop. Art has always been a big aspect of her life and became the more central focus after leaving her farm. Now she does freelance illustration and her own art in watercolor and ink, mostly landscapes and flower and tree studies. And so you can see her work obviously here on the cover and then in the interior. Okay, so I do remember my first question, which was, would one of you be willing to tell us the story of the pupfish, why it matters, and what happened?
Yeah, I will do that. One person that we have missing is Elaine Miller Bond, who's the one that actually wrote the story. It ended up coming to, by reaching out to me via phone call and asking if the Eastern Sierra Interpretive Association would be interested in publishing a children's book. And probably if she would have called 8 years ago, I probably would have said no. But we had just finished publishing Born Free and Equal, Ansel Adams' book from Manzanar. So I'd sort of had a little bit of a taste of it. So I thought, well, yeah, we can do this again. And then as I got off the phone, I realized maybe I shouldn't have said yes. But then I thought of Joe. I knew I had Joe in my back pocket. So I want to share a little bit. Elaine did send me, she's not able to make it down, and how it all came about that she came across the book, or the idea for a book. It seems to be for many years that she had been traveling to Death Valley National Park and going and trying to find the pupfish. She seemed to have an affinity for those little fish, and so on a couple of occasions that she was able to see the Devil's Hole pupfish. And then a friend of hers actually mentioned the Phil Pister story, Phil's effort to save the pupfish in the fish slough just north of Bishop. And from that, and her inspiration of the fish, she began to realize that she would like to share that story. And so she ended up sending a letter to Phil Pister asking him if he would have any interest in her doing a book. And I think at the time it was not going to be a children's book. And lo and behold, he actually called her back and said, yeah, I think it would be great. And from what she shares, it was not necessarily, he had written a piece, can't remember what it was called, but yeah. What was it again? Yep, Species in a Bucket. So she thought, I can't redo that. So, but what I could do is focus on children. and getting them to recognize the importance of all species and how they play a part in our sort of ecosystem and why it is important. So that was sort of the impetus to get the idea of doing a children's book on Phil Pister and the pupfish. A little long, sorry.
No, thank you very much. I wanted to give some background there, so that's perfect. My next question is related to that. So for you, Jeff, what was your inspiration for ESIA to make this into a book, especially a children's book, from an ESIA standpoint?
Well, one is obviously what we are to do. We've been in operation for 54 years, and we were created to be an extension at the time for the Forest Service on education and interpretation. So this fits nicely into that realm of what we're supposed to be doing, which is helping educating the public about our natural resources, the land that is managed by the Forest Service, and now our partners with the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management. And in many cases, people do not know. It's not that they're abusive about our resources, it's just they don't know. So the more that we can do to help educate and provide that interpretation is really beneficial. So I thought this was a great opportunity. And actually, before Elaine called, I had just met personally Phil. And I absolutely adored our conversation. He had such a great spirit. He will be certainly missed.
Has he passed away? Oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, I see. Well, yeah, I'm especially glad then that we're able to represent this book this year at the festival. So, Joe, once you got involved in this project, what process did you follow to develop the book project?
Yeah, so Elaine, Jeff, and I first sat down actually at the Pupfish Cafe to discuss the project. Appropriate, yeah. And that was just before a thing called COVID happened. So we sat down at that initial meeting and kind of just looking through, saying, okay, yeah, we want to proceed forward with this. What's the next step? And the next steps were making sure we had final text in place, or at least text that wouldn't change. It's an illustrated book, so naturally we can't have substantive content changing across the page, because once illustrations start, that would be costly to fix. So making sure we were at that point. And I think Elaine needed maybe a couple months to kind of bring it up to that with her editors that she worked with. Then it was asking, who do we want to illustrate it? Elaine, the author, was kind of pushing for some folks she knew out of the Bay Area, and I advocated that we keep it local. So Phil's local, it's a local story. The Eastern Sierra is filled with talented artists. And so we brought up, I think, maybe 2 to 3 different illustrators and looked at their style and asked, okay, who's going to be appropriate for not only a children's book, but a book that adults are going to be reading as well. And ideally someone that folks know in the Eastern Sierra. They have a connection with it. To expand upon that connection with Phil, create a connection to our illustrator as well. And Susan's illustrations and her being here just fit perfectly with it. And her style really, I think, fit the narrative perfectly as well. And so unfortunately Susan agreed to come on board. So, which I know children's books aren't her normal area. And that was wonderful being able to bring her on. So then, of course, pandemic happened, and we all kind of shut down for a while, and maybe even, kind of forgot about it. And I want to say it was probably fall 2020 when you came back and said, okay, let's fire it up again.
It looks like it's not the end of times after all.
Yeah, it's not the end of times after all. Let's do this. And so we had our text ready to go, and at that point it was making sure that Susan had the availability and fitting into her schedule, and starting to look at, okay, what's our budget for this? What's our timeline for this? And putting together, budgets are all estimates, and especially at that time, paper costs were spiraling. Printers wouldn't give me good quotes. They would say, hey, like, this is going to change next week. So if you're printing in 2 years, like, take this with a grain of salt. So we were able to put together a budget, though, that I think we actually came in really close to at the end of the day, and figure out a timeline for illustration. Then the process was, I wanted to make sure we could stay on track with delivery, and so I parallel process. So Susan was developing the illustrations, and then at the same time I was handling the design and going through the iterations of that. With each new batch of illustrations that Susan would finish, those would get plugged in to our draft template, which then could be sent to Jeff to review to make sure everything was looking good on his side. We could send it out for fundraising efforts as well. And so we had this, and Susan had backing up, she had done sketches first, and then we went through those sketches, kind of picked them apart, figured out what we wanted, then dove into actually making the illustrations. So we didn't commit down a time-consuming factor in that way. So we parallel processed both of those developmental efforts, the design and the illustrations. And then once illustrations were complete, we were able to go to printing, doing all of our color management, and delivering the book.
So this book is not a print on demand. You've printed copies of this, is that right?
Yeah, this is printed on an offset printer. It was printed by Friesens out of Canada. It's a 4-color process, printed book, sewn binding. Children's books, you want a sewn binding, I have a child. I mean, she eats the books. So, obviously I've kept this one away from her. You absolutely need a sewn binding for a children's book. We had custom embossing and debossing on the cover as well. And then these are actually printed end papers, so these are custom end papers as well, they're not stock. So, yeah.
That's for the color. You wanted that color.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can you just open? I was hoping you would open it to the middle. Yeah. I like the end papers, but it'd be kind of fun to see the inside too.
And so we have, at the front of the book, we have an overview map of the area that also shows other pupfish species throughout the greater Death Valley, Owens Valley region. And then we get into the actual story itself, and I'll go into the design of that a little bit later, so that's a later question. And as you go through the book, you'll see, because the story takes place, it starts in the morning and kind of gets later and later and later in the day to our climax where Phil saves the pupfish. They're losing their oxygen in their pond, essentially, and Phil's the only one out there. They're all going to die. These are the only fish, what are they? Yeah, this is the only subspecies that exist, and they're all in this one pond. Phil's the only person out there. It's getting dark, so you can see our skies are fading here, which Susan did a wonderful job with. And as we go along, it gets darker and darker. Phil's having to stumble through the rough brush and rocks of the fish slough to save the species. And then at the end of the book, we have some naturalist information about pupfish. We have a memorial here to Phil with a photo that was provided by a professional photographer who's based out of Bishop. He's actually a climbing photographer, but did some studio portraiture with live pupfish and built a case to do that. So we're really fortunate to have that. And then we have photos provided by CDFW, so California Department of Fish and Wildlife, with the research that they do with the pupfish. And then one of the things we did in the design, so Elaine did a wonderful job of documenting all of her research and providing that bibliography. So not only is this a children's book, but it's actually scientific as well, and somewhat scholarly. And rather than providing complicated URLs printed, we use QR codes. And some of these actually, like this one here, links to a video of an oral history with Phil out at Fish Slough. So if a kid or a parent has their phone with them, they can scan that and watch an oral history with Phil.
What a cool project. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you for showing us the inside, too. I hadn't realized that you'd done all that. I think that's one of the challenges with this kind of story, right, is that it's essentially a scientific story. So how are you going to present that in a way to children that's also authentic and correct, right? So Susan, my gosh, what a beautiful job you've done with those illustrations. Yeah, they're really remarkable. And you know, illustrations really can set the tone for a book, right? We get a feel for it right away as soon as we see the cover. And let me ask you, what were you aiming for in terms of mood and tone with your illustration?
Well, I mean, certainly I mostly wanted to represent the landscape, which is like the big character in the story, and the fish, of course. So I wanted to get that across really strongly. And also I started working on the book a year before Phil died, so I got to know Phil in his last year of life. And he's really sweet. He was really a sweet, likable, interesting guy. And so I wanted to present him also with warmth, because that's how I felt about him. And he just exuded his dedication to fish and wildlife. And I spent a lot of time. I went down to Fish Slough and spent a number of days sketching and finding the pupfish and kind of just absorbing that landscape, and wanted to be able to communicate it, because it really is kind of a, you know, I've lived in Bishop for 12 years, and I have driven on the road that is sort of near the Fish Slough, but just going by, and it just looks like a, you know, not terribly exciting, you know, desert landscape. But then getting down in there, and the first time Joe took me out there, it's really a fascinating place. I mean, anytime you have water in the desert, it's always kind of a magical place. So, yeah, I wanted to really communicate that, what a cool place it was. And it's, you know, I love the Eastern Sierra, so just wanted to get that across too.
So I'm going to ask a spontaneous question here, so yeah, fair warning. I was curious about the insects on the cover. Yeah, so I presume you did those as well.
Yeah.
And what was the thought process behind doing those?
This is actually from one of the illustrations inside. At one point we were thinking of as using it as the cover, but this one got chosen for the cover, and so that was kind of, we thought that would get across the idea of the book, or Joe thought it would get across the idea of the book. And then the little circles, the fish, and then in here there's also some little flower studies and stuff. That was a total afterthought, and I just drew them at the end of the whole project and said, Joe, why don't you stick these in here somewhere?
Yeah, they're almost like ornamentation.
Yeah, it's kind of like an old-timey feel in a book to have those little insects. So, yeah. So, yeah, that's what happened there. And I think, I mean, Joe came up with that cover design, which I think was awesome.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that it has that sort of throwback feel. You know, that's what's interesting about illustrations, is you get a feel of it without really knowing why, or without really, for me at least, being able to verbalize how that works.
You know, it's probably from reading children's books as kids, right? I mean, it's like in there. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Our brains have been formed by,
Yeah.
by books. Yeah, exactly. All right, and this is for anyone. These days, it seems as though book projects are really team projects. So if you were interested in providing guidance to someone in the audience who might contemplate this kind of project, what advice would you give to them, and how would you organize yourself to keep things going forward?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it first. I do firmly believe that you need a small team to make a high quality book. And one of the things I often caution a lot of folks I work with when we start a project is, as an author, as an illustrator, you open up your heart, you pour your creative efforts and emotions into this process to create this thing. And then when you say, okay, I want to make it public and hand it over to the world, then you do need to you need that team to make it happen. And the second you do that, the second you bring on that team, it's still something you created, but it becomes something more than that. And the creative process expands and becomes bigger than what just you did. Often I caution people this during the editing process, but it's also part of design, and it's part of the inevitable compromises that you have to make in producing a book. So yeah, a team gets you a really high quality product at the end of the day. But it requires compromise, it requires open communication. And there's going to be challenges there, of course, and just navigating through that and knowing at the beginning of the process to give yourself the space for that, both the temporal, the time space, but also the emotional space for that and what that entails. Again, you create something beautiful, and then you're saying, all right, I need editors, I need designers, I need people to help pay for it, to make it happen, to distribute it. You're relying on those people, and you have to trust those people and have faith in that process.
The part that I would add to that is this would not have been able to happen without Joe. And Joe, we really hadn't worked together before, but I knew of what Joe did, and so it was kind of a shooting in the dark going, Joe, so I have this project I want to do. You think you might want to help? And he was very gracious in doing that. And I think from that it was really easy to be able to talk to Joe. And we were able to walk through a lot of the challenges that we had. But it wasn't this tug-of-war type. It was very, okay, here's what I'm thinking. Okay, that sounds good, but what about this? Oh, that's a good point. So it seemed as though it worked very well for us working together, which helped work with Susan as the illustrator and Elaine as the author, because as Elaine mentioned a number of times, as an author, once you publish the book, you pretty much lose the rights to it. But we made a strong effort to have her a part of it and let her sort of be in the initial phase of the illustrations of what it wanted to look like and so forth, because she had a vision of what she wanted it to be, and we wanted to be respectful of that. So I think more importantly is just finding that right individual that you can work well with and you feel comfortable with. And that, I will have to say, is definitely what happened here. And I will mention real quickly, so I don't forget, that we are very gracious to the Eastern Sierra Land Trust and the Altrusa International. Both organizations provide financial contribution to help publish the book, so I want to recognize their financial contribution.
What do you think went well, or has turned out well, and what would you do differently?
Without having COVID, it would have went really well. Obviously, that was a big hump that we had to overcome. But I can't necessarily think of anything that really, it went very smoothly. Susan did a wonderful job of making sure. I think probably one of our initial challenges because of the pandemic was keeping ourselves on track with the contract that we had with Elaine as the author and meeting the deadlines within that contract. That was, I think, one thing that was pushing us a little bit to make sure that we were going to meet those deadlines. But I can't think of anything. It went wonderfully well. I don't know, Joe may have a different opinion.
Yeah, I agree. It went incredibly well. I think on any project, you wind up pushing against deadlines, I've found, no matter what. Even if you plan everything out perfectly, there's always something. And I know in the final couple weeks, Susan and I ran into some color management challenges with our initial proofs, and that's the reason for that is Susan's paintings are done, they're so rich and the colors are so deep the gamut range, so the color range that you'll see in the actual artwork, you cannot replicate that on a 4-color printer, period. And so we ran into some challenges in the 11th hour with that, and trying to, again, hit this deadline, which I'm like, oh my god, this is like a month away, and navigate and be like, okay, how do we digitally get this so that we're doing justice to her artwork, but working within the confines of commercial printing. So, yeah. And yeah, in that process, so all the scanning was done by Ron at Bishop Art Supply, and who's a very talented artist, and of course, aid to artists. And for all of my projects, I run all of the scanning and digitization typically through Ron, especially for stuff like this. And Ron actually donated a fair bit of his time to helping us figure out those challenges in navigating that process. As did the printer. Frieson's was wonderful, again, out of Canada. They supplied us with the tech who helped us to figure out how to really be true to our colors and not lose them. So, yeah.
I'd just like to add that actually the whole deadline question, because some of the earlier stages kind of dragged on getting everyone's input on the sketches, and should we do this, or should we do that, and changing the text a little bit, and then Joe said, okay, can you have them done by August? I said, absolutely not. And so actually there was a lot of flexibility, and you gave me an extra 10 months or something, which was nice, because it's not something you want to rush through, right? I mean, it's something you want to do. So I appreciated, while there was a deadline concern, I was given really basically total leeway for a little while there. Yeah. And I think we needed it to just absorb the new deadline. So, yeah, anyway, so thank you guys for that part.
I just happened to think about that when Joe was talking. We actually did have a really hiccup at the very end. As Joe said, we used the Canadian company to print it, which they had an operation in North Dakota, but they shut it down. So the person that gave me the address was their company's address. So I sent a check to this address, which, as you well know, the Postal Service isn't the speediest. And so I wasn't about ready to write another $22,000 check until I got the other one back. So we had to figure out another means of getting the financial cost to them to be able to pay for the printing of the book, because they weren't going to print the book until they had the money in the bank. And but I wasn't going to give them another one without knowing that, yes, it's coming back and we're going to be able to avoid that check. But that was a little bit of a nerve-wracking at the end, because it really hit the deadline of not being able to have it published. And so finally I've got the right address in Canada to send it to, but that was a real challenge.
That's crazy, right? Comes down to the end, yes. In our world of technological advances, where's the check? Is it in North Dakota? Is it in Canada? Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, so my question here was for Susan. Can you give us a sense of how long it took you to illustrate the book? And I just want to tag on here. You've mentioned having some extra time, and it sounds like that's actually where some of these little ornamentation things came in. So, it seems like you really took advantage of that and really added something special to the book.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to really pin it down, because there was a whole period of time of just doing rough sketches and then a little more finished sketches to get the content right. But then I'd say for the paint, and I usually only work maybe really 3 hours a day on painting stuff, because that's just my most focus. I mean, that's my best focus time. I can do other things later, but and so I basically painted over a fall, winter, into spring. And that's also my best time of year for working, right? I mean, summer is a hard time to stay indoors and paint. so yeah. It's as close as I can get on that one.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention, I don't know how many people in the audience are interested in children's books, But I was thinking, this is actually fairly common for the text to be done first and the illustrations to come after. I hear that question a lot from children's authors about when they submit to an agent, do they need to include illustrations? And the answer is no, just submit your text, and then the illustrations will come after that. So the process that you use is very typical. Go ahead,
And
please.
actually, when I've limited contact with publishers, they don't want you to bring an illustrator with you. They want to choose someone.
Yeah, and it's really an indication, right, of how important the illustrations are. That they want to control that, right, because it affects how the book comes across so profoundly. Right. Yeah. Joe, from a design and project management standpoint, what made this project unique, if anything?
Yeah, great question. I think, we're talking about it within the framework of being a children's book, but it's also a legacy. It's the Pupfish Hero. We're documenting this piece of environmental heroism that occurred. And again, as we produced this, Phil passed away. And so it's not only a children's book, it's not only a book that we're hoping that children connect with, but that their parents connect with, but it's also a memorial to Phil. And so in the design process, that was part of my, inspiration was, how do we make this so it's appealing to children? And one of my neighbors, as we were producing it, came up to me and said, "Oh, Susan's artwork, we have that in our house, and our 4-year-old loves it." And I was just like, "Oh, great, okay, home run, we're set there." Then the question was, how do we arrange it so that the memorial doesn't necessarily look like a children's book? The children, they look at it and say, "This book's for me." But to Phil's daughter, Anne, to her, it looks like documenting his legacy and being true to that and honoring that in a timeless format. So, so that's kind of a high level, part of it. But then what does that actually look like? One of the kind of questions I had in the process, most children's books you will see have a full bleed, so the image is going to extend off of the edge of the paper. And as you can see, Susan's illustrations, again, are incredibly deep, colorful, vibrant. One of the things I noticed when we did the full bleed was that you could your eye almost would just get lost in just how beautiful it was and all of the color. And when we put that nice gallery white frame around it, that it kind of focused the eye. It kind of calmed the reader a little bit, kind of calms the child a little bit, so you can sit with that illustration. And again, it adds that nice gallery, museum-looking frame to it. So touching it up, adding that little bit of an element that we would expect from the piece, honoring someone's legacy. So that was a challenge, and that was unique. And it was something, again, up until the last minute, I was making subtle changes to the design because things just didn't quite feel right. And it really wasn't until the books arrived that I was still wondering, would we get it right? And I feel that we did. And then that final page, which I showed briefly in the back matter, of Phil's memorial. And, I feel so fortunate. CDFW, the folks at California Department of Fish and Wildlife, had alerted me that Ben, who is a friend, had gone out and taken these portrait photos. And I saw those photos, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is perfect. We have this sort of, memorial page for Phil, but it feels empty, it feels lacking. And I saw his photos and said, this is perfect. This does it. So that was a challenge in the design process and was unique.
So we have 5 minutes left, so I want to open it to the audience for questions. Yes, Eric, please.
Joe, you say it's a children's book. what age range?
Yeah, great question. My almost 2-year-old is a little too young for it, I would say. She does love looking at the photos, though. But otherwise, really, it's all ages. So, again, it's something that we have adults buy for themselves. They buy it for their coffee tables. This is Phil's story has been and is legend in the Owens Valley in the Eastern Sierra. This is not a work of fiction. This is reality. So, yeah, we have, maybe Jeff knows the answer to this, but I feel like as many people who have bought this for a child have bought it for an adult. And I know people who have said, oh, I'm buying this for all kinds of adults in my family as Christmas gifts. It's such a wonderful story. So, all ages.
Lady Green, where can I get the book?
There's a table right over there that says Eastern Sierra Interpretive Association, and they're for sale. I bought an entire box. And more in Bishop.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I assume that this is at least in the library here. How do you take that should be in libraries everywhere? And what is your role in getting them into libraries?
Oh, how do we take a book like this and get it into libraries if it's in libraries? And what's our role?
It has been, and in addition to that, I just happened to be thinking of that one, the last question, but the Inyo County for Education purchased 300 books, and they gave to every fourth grader in Inyo County. So every fourth grader received a copy, and at the same time, we have provided opportunities for libraries to have the book. We haven't had many agree to take up some on that, but so I'm not sure. But yeah, we're figuring out ways. That's one part of the contract that we're trying to meet, which is a national sort of promotion of the book. So, but if you have an answer to that, I'd love to hear it.
I found the QR code, the gateway to a different type of medium, interesting that you brought that up. And hearing this for the first time with the team, all this effort to create the art, the imagination, the storyline, right? To create this product, what are your thoughts about creating that QR code to take a gateway to film and another type of medium that kind of steers you away from all this energy that you put on this product, but yet you've provided that gateway simply to go somewhere else that seems to be so opposite of your product? What are the thoughts on the team providing that?
Jeff and Susan may have different thoughts on it, but I think it's just that it's a gateway, and gateways can be great things. At the point that they come across those QR codes, it's the end of the book. So they aren't at the front of the book. We haven't distracted them yet. They've made it to the end of the book. We're providing that opportunity for further learning and further engagement in a medium that people are using. I mean, we're all doing this, so yeah, I think it's a good thing. Yeah.
The thing I would add is that initially Elaine was wanting to add more sort of pages of written scientific, and it didn't seem to really fit the book. And I think the QR code is a way of being able to at least meet that, but yet not take a bunch of pages and kind of like, is this a children's book or is this a adult book? What is exactly this? So it kind of fits nicely in sort of the space.
Yeah, it makes me think also that those fourth graders might look at that book in 8 years and then follow the QR codes, right? That they kind of grow with the book or the book grows with them, which is kind of interesting. More questions?
How do you feel as an artist, though, that you've created this world and this environment through art and imagination, only to be led to actual film? Does it seem to defeat you, or are you
No. It's all good, right? I mean, it's about Phil, it's about the fish slough, there's room for lots of, ways. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for your questions. Really appreciate it. And please, let's thank the panel for their time. Thank you.